Unfailing love. Do you believe that about God? About his love? That the love of God is unfailing? Do you believe that God's love endures forever? It can be hard to believe that sometimes, can't it? Sometimes in our lives, there seems to be so much evidence to the contrary of this statement that God's love never fails, that there's no circumstance in life in which God's love ever fails. It can be hard to believe that sometimes. There's this Hebrew word, hesed. Now, to say it right, like any good Hebrew word, you actually have to spit all over yourself. Like hesed. I'm just going to say hesed. We'll save the spit. This word, hesed, it means love. But it's not just any love, it's God's love for us. Some have suggested you can't actually translate this word without like a paragraph or a whole book to explain. Like this book, the Bible, is the story of hesed. It's often translated as steadfast love, or enduring love, or love and mercy, love and goodness, loving kindness. Hesed is a one-word summary of the character of God. It's in one word summing up everything about who God is and how God relates to his people. One writer suggested we might define hesed this way. It's the consistent, ever-faithful, relentless, constantly pursuing, lavish, extravagant, unrestrained, furious love of our Father God. Hesed. The love of God that cannot fail, that endures forever. This is who God is, and this is how he cares for his people. Would you imagine with me, you're sitting in church, and you see in front of you a hymnal. That's what this is. And for some reason, this day you reach out and you pick up your hymnal, and you begin to flip through it. Maybe it's been a long time since you've ever picked up a hymnal. Maybe you've never touched one before, and you're curious. What's this hymnal thing? Actually, if you've got Bibles with you, I'd invite you to turn to Psalm 89. Psalm 89. Psalm 89 is the last psalm in book 3 of the Psalms. Maybe you've never noticed before that the book of Psalms is divided into 5 different books that are put together to make our one book of the Psalms. And Psalm 89 is the last book, is the last psalm of book 3. And so just imagine that you're flipping through this hymnal and you land at the very last song. For some reason, it catches your attention. Maybe you realize that churches never sing the last song in the hymnal. And so you begin to read the last song, Psalm 89. And the first verse of this song says, I will sing of the Lord's great love forever. Hesed, right there. I will sing of God's hesed, his unfailing, relentless, pursuing, loving kindness, mercy, and goodness for his people. The hesed of God. I will sing of the Lord's great love forever. With my mouth I will make your faithfulness known through all generations. I will declare that your love stands firm forever, that you have established your faithfulness in heaven itself. Perhaps you love to sing about God's love. And so you're drawn into the first verse of this song at the very end of our songbook. Or maybe today you really need to be reminded of God's love. And you say, I need to hear this today. And so you continue to read in this song that proclaims the greatness of God's love. And so you get to a second verse of the song that has a promise of God's love to endure forever. Look at verses 14, 15, 16, Psalm 89, righteousness and justice, the hymn writer says, are the foundation of your throne. Love and faithfulness go before you, God. Blessed are those who have learned to acclaim you, who walk in the light of your presence, Lord. They rejoice in your name all day long. They celebrate your righteousness, for you are their glory and strength. What a great reminder that love and faithfulness are what go before our God, and that for those of us who rejoice in him, that is our glory and strength, that the love and faithfulness of God become our strength. Some days I need to be reminded of that. I need to be reminded of that. So we continue to read in this final song in our songbook, and we get to verse 3. Which is about how you know that God's love is real in your life. So how for us and today would we know that God's love is real? Think about how do you know that you are experiencing God's love? For the ancient Israelites, one of the primary ways that they knew that they were living in the reality of God's Hesed was that there was a kingdom called Israel, and there was a king that sat on the throne. And so there's a verse here, a stanza of this song about how God's Hesed is revealed through the kingship of David, and that God has promised that David would be on the king forever. And that through the kingdom, we know that God's love is present with his people. But then the next part of the psalm. See, there's a problem. In 587 BC, Jerusalem was destroyed and the king was removed from the throne. And suddenly now, in the next verses of Psalm 89, this next stanza of this final hymn in the songbook says, God, you had promised to be with us forever, but now the king is gone. And God, it feels like you've abandoned us. God, your actions don't look like what we expect. If Hesed is Hesed, if your love for us is true, if it never fails, and you have promised that through the king will be a sign of your love for us forever, and now there is no king, this isn't what we thought it would look like. And God, it looks like you've left us, and your love is not with us anymore. Maybe you can relate to that. I doubt any of you have ever really have prayed strongly for God to restore the king. Most of us probably have never wished that there was a king ruling over us as a sign of God's love. But there are ways that we have come to understand that God's love is with us. And when we don't see those things anymore, when life doesn't turn out the way that we thought it was supposed to because God loves us, we ask the same questions that this hymn writer asks. And in fact, the final stanza of this hymn, this psalm that ends this songbook, are purely just questions that he cries out to God. Verse 46, how long, Lord, will you hide yourself forever? The psalm opens with the forever of God's love, God's Hesed that will endure forever. God's love will be with us forever. But now, at the end of the song, it's God that is hiding forever. How long will your wrath burn like fire, God? Remember how fleeting is my life, for what futility you have created all humanity. Who can live and not see death, or who can escape the power of the grave? And this final question, Lord, where is your former great love, which in your faithfulness you swore to David? Where is your former great love? Now, the word there is Hesed. Where is your former Hesed? Now, if Hesed is love that endures and never fails, to call it former is to say that it isn't what it is. Hesed can't be former because it endures forever. What he is saying is, God, right now I don't really believe that your love endures forever. I don't believe that Hesed, unfailing love of God, is what is true in the world. Hesed is not Hesed. The unending love of God has ended. God has failed us. God's love has left us. We have been abandoned. And that's the end of the song. And not only that, it's the last song in your songbook. And that's where the songbook ends. God, where is your former great love? Some of you might might find comfort in the lingering of that question. To let a songwriter whose song ends book 3 of the Psalms in our Bible, to give voice to the question that you are asking. God, where is your great love? I thought you said, God, that you would love us forever and that your love would endure forever. But when I look at my life, I wonder, God, where's your love? Or I look at what tragedies have befallen those that I've loved. God, if your love is real, how can this be happening? Or we look at the state of the world today and we see these global crises, something like the AIDS epidemic, and we say, God, if your love never fails, how can this be true? How can this be what's happening in the world? And we're left with this question, God, where is your former great love? And some of you, this is your question. But there might be others of you who, if you were really finding that as the last song in the hymn book that ends with a question of whether God has abandoned us or not, some of you might say, we can't end there. Yes, this is an important question, and we can't deny this question. We can't run from the question that sometimes we wonder what's happened to God's love, but you might say, we can't end the story there. There needs to be another song. Maybe you'd be the one to write it. To say that's a great question, and we need to write a response to that. And that's exactly what happens in our hymnal, Psalm 107. And if you're in your Bible, flip over to there. Is the first psalm of book 5. This question that ends book 3, God, where is your former great love? Psalm 107 was probably written as an answer to that very question. To say, we can't end our songbook there. And this is how the hymn of Psalm 107 begins. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his love endures forever. That even in the midst of this question, this is written after the exile, after the king has been removed from the throne, and even in the midst of the questions of wondering, where is the great love of God, the songwriter writes, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his love does endure forever. Hesed is Hesed. What defines God, even in the midst of our questions, is that God's enduring love never fails. His love and mercy are with us, even when we can't see it. And so he says, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Those God has redeemed from the hand of the foe, those he gathered from the lands. He says, we who have experienced the reality of the presence of God's love in our life must tell our story. Because in telling our story, we bear witness to the fact that God's love is present with us even when we can't see it. That when it looks like God's love is failing, to share our stories of how his love has not failed us testifies to the whole world that God's love does endure. And so that's exactly what Psalm 107 does. It tells 4 stories about 4 different groups of people who were in tragedy and grief and need. And it begins with the story of some people who were wandering in the desert, hungry and thirsty, at the point of starvation and death. In verse 6, they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. God led them by a straight way to a city where they could settle. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love, for his hesed, and his wonderful deeds for humankind. And then there's the story of people who were put in prison, locked up and left to die, rotting in prison. In verse 13, those left in prison cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness and broke away their chains. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for humankind. And then there's the story about some who make some bad choices in their life, and they are suffering affliction. They are sick to the point of death. And in verse 19, they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them. He rescued them from the grave. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for humankind. And then the fourth story is about a group of sailors who were caught out at sea in a storm, and the storm is raging, the winds are blowing, and they know they're about to die. Verse 28, they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea he hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for humankind. The psalm writer says, there has been story after story after story throughout the history of the earth where people were in desperate need. And it looks like they were left alone in their trouble and in their distress and in their need and in their grief and in their suffering, but they cried out to God. And God rescued them, God healed them, God saved them. And what the psalm writer says is we need to let these stories strengthen our faith so that when we are doubting the presence of God's love, when we can't see that God's love is enduring in the midst of our situation, to let these stories of the faithfulness of God remind us that God is faithful in our lives, God is faithful in our world, God is faithful in our community, even when we can't see it. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. This becomes more than just the first verse of Psalm 107. It becomes a statement of faith that's throughout the ending of the Psalms. It comes up over and over and over again. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his love does endure forever. It's a statement of faith. It's a short creed that summarizes what it is that we believe about God. His love does endure forever. This simple verse teaches us about what it means to live in the reality of God's love, what it means to be citizens of his kingdom, and three things it does to instruct us on how to live. First, it's a call to thanksgiving. It's a call to be thankful people. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. When we cry out to God and he meets our needs, he shows up in our life, we are called to give thanks, to be thankful people. It can be so easy to be focused on our needs, to be focused on the place where our life isn't going the way that we wish it was, to be focused on the difficulties and troubles in the world, that we can forget all of the good things that God has given to us. Psalm 107 is a declaration of our utter dependence of God for everything in our life. Did you wake up and breathe today? That's because of God. We would have no life at all without God's granting and grace of him giving us life. And so we are called to be thankful people because of that. We are called to be thankful people. In Luke's gospel, there's the story of 10 lepers that saw Jesus, and like the people in this Psalm 107, when they saw Jesus, they cried out to him. And Jesus saw them, and he said to these 10 lepers, go show yourself to the priests. And in obedience, they're on their way to see the priests, and on the way, they are healed of their leprosy. One of these lepers, who turns out to be a Samaritan, turns back and comes to Jesus and falls at Jesus' feet, crying out in thanksgiving. Now, earlier in Luke's gospel, there was another leper who fell at Jesus' feet to beg for Jesus to heal him. And then there's the story of the centurion who fell at Jesus' feet begging him to heal his daughter, crying out to Jesus out of their need. But now here's the story of someone who falls at Jesus' feet in passionate, overwhelmed, not with need, not with begging Jesus to do something for them, but falling at Jesus' feet to cry out his thanksgiving. To say thank you. And Jesus looks at this healed leper and says, in his thanksgiving, I see great faith. What that story has been challenging me about as we've just come through the Thanksgiving season is that the depth of my faith is measured in some part by the depth of my gratitude. I can't have any more faith in God than I have gratitude for who God is and what he has done in my life and what he is doing in the world. And that story has been challenging me. How easy is it to sit around the Thanksgiving table and just say thank you for some simple things and allow that to become a substitute for falling at Jesus' feet and crying out, thank you for what you have done, for life and grace and mercy. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. It calls us to be thankful people. But this psalm also calls us to be Advent people. There's a reminder in this that God's love never fails, even when we don't see it. It becomes a way to voice our faith, to say, God, I don't see your love right now, but I'm going to believe it's here anyway. To look in the tragedies of our life, to look in the tragedies of the world and believe that God's love is still there, even though I don't see it. To look at something like the AIDS crisis. And maybe we say, God, I don't see your love in this. But I'm going to believe that somehow you're at work in that anyway. We're called to be people that in the midst of crisis and grief and tragedy and despair and hopelessness, to believe that somehow God's love endures even in the midst of that. To believe that as real as the tragedies of the world are, that God's love is more real. That God's love is what truly endures. And this verse calls us to be those kind of people who believe that God's love endures even when we can't see it. And we need to be people who speak this into each other's lives, who believe this for each other. There are some days when it's really easy for me to believe in the enduring love of God. But then there are some days that it's hard. And on those days that it's hard, I need you who on this day it's easy for you to see it, to help me to believe. This is why corporate worship is so important for us. To gather together as the people of God on a regular basis, because there's some of us in the room right now who are convinced, who have assurance of the enduring love of God. And it's easy for you to believe it. And there's others of you today who are having a really hard time seeing the enduring love of God in your life or in the world right now. And we need to believe together that those who have assurance of the love of God and those who are doubting come together and bolster one another's faith, who speak this truth, who call us to be a people who see the love of God no matter what is happening in our lives or in the world. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever is a call to thanksgiving. It's a reminder also that God's love never fails, even when we can't see it. And finally, it's a call to an active faith. That if we believe that God's love endures, even when we can't see it, and we look at a tragedy, and we say, God's love is there. And I can't see it right now, but I'm going to respond as if God's love is present in this. And in the response, we actually make God's love visible. It's a phenomenal thing that happens. If we look at the AIDS epidemic and I say, I don't know where God's love is in this, but I believe that it is, and I'm going to respond as if God's love is there. And in our response, it's actually what makes God's love visible to the world. In Romans, it says that we're to mourn with those who are mourning. And when someone is mourning, when we walk alongside of them, believing that God's love is present in this situation, even if we can't see it, as we mourn with them, we're actually the ones who make God's love visible to them. And so this is a call to an active faith, that when we believe that God's love endures, to respond out of that even when we don't see it. And in the response, we become the ones who show God's love in tragedy and pain and difficulty. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Do you believe that today? Do you have the assurance that God's love endures? Or maybe today's a day that it's hard for you to see it. As we end our chapel today, I'm going to ask us to speak Psalm 107:1 together. A short, responsive refrain to proclaim the reality of God's love, to let us call us to a faith that believes in the enduring love of God no matter what. So just a minute, I'm going to ask us to stand, and I'm going to say, give thanks to the Lord for he is good, and you're going to say his love endures forever. To let this be a creed that calls us to live in the reality of God's enduring love. Well, this is what I want to do. This morning, if you have the assurance of God's enduring love, you say today, I am sure that this is the most real thing in the world, that God's love endures forever, and there's nothing that will ever stop that, and you have that assurance. Today, I would like you to stand. If you are people that are sure of God's enduring love today, you have that assurance. And when we do our little repetition of Psalm 107:1, I need you to be bold. Some of you probably stood right now who don't really have that assurance. Because I also want to invite those who aren't sure of that today, but who want to be called into this reality, this knowledge, this assurance that God's love endures forever. You say, I can't see it. I look at what's going on in my life. I look what's happening in my friend's life. I look what's going on in the world, and I am not sure that this is true. But I want to be called into this assurance. I want you to stand with us too. And let's proclaim this reality that is the foundation of what is most real in the world, the enduring love of God. I will say, give thanks to the Lord for he is good. And with boldness, you will respond, his love endures forever. Let us proclaim what is real. And it's this truth. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. We're going to sing about that as you go. And I dismiss you. I send you today to be ambassadors of God's love, to live with the assurance that his love endures forever. Go with God.